You're listening to Parasearch Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
Hello, how is everyone? No, you don't need to turn your volume up. It's Penny. You probably saw in my post that I've been suffering with laryngitis for the last few days, but as ever, the show must go on. When you've got such a cracking interview that I've got to play for you tonight, I'm going to battle through for the next couple of minutes. I've been resting my voice and drinking as many fluids all day as possible so that I could at least do the 2-3 minute intro for you. So, hi everyone, I hope you're well. Well, what's everyone been up to? It's hi Richard. It's nearly the end of the school summer holidays, and whilst part of me is a bit sad, it means I'll have to get dressed in the mornings and not lounge around the house in my pyjamas until 9 o'clock. It also means that I'll be able to get back to some kind of routine, shall we say, and actually be able to work without bribing the kids with electronic gadgets to keep quiet whilst I'm trying to write a report. But apart from that, so what's everyone been up to? Well, I was lucky enough, as you probably saw me mention on the live, or you heard me mention on the live, hopefully after all the tech issues on Monday, I went to visit the Hellfire Caves with Barry Guy and his wonderful crew. It was a really interesting night, and yes, there were a few things that happened that I couldn't explain. So it's definitely one, if you've never been, put it on your bucket list and go, especially when it's hot outside, because it's quite chilly in there, which is quite good. It's quite good. What else do I want to mention? Well, the Paranormal Charity Warriors, their event is still going on in it's a week on Saturday, I believe, at a Bromham Mill to raise money for lipodystrophy. They're going to have some cracking guests there. Hi, Mr. Rourke. They're going to have some cracking guests there. Hold on 1 second, sorry. I'm pushing through. Stop it, Rourke. Stop it, or I'll come in your chat room and hurl abuse at you. I'm still here. I'm not one of the ones that dropped off. Yes, so Paranormal Charity Warriors, there's going to be a few guys from Parasearch there as well. Thank you, Paul. There's going to be a few guys from Parasearch Radio there as well. And there's even a chance our good friend Ryan Griffiths, my brother from another mother, might be turning up. So if you can make it to that one, go and buy a ticket. Or if you can't, go and sponsor Jay to wear his SpongeBob gimp suit. I think the guy needs danger money. He's going to have a concussion by the end of that night. I know he is. But my throat's going already. It's starting to hurt. So I am going to play you this cracker of an interview. Have a listen. Well, people, it's the guest a lot of you seem to have been waiting for this year. I've just been telling him how well known he is, say in the UK and amongst the paranormal community, and I don't really think he believes me. But this gentleman, he's an incredible photographer. You can go onto his website and check out some of his work. He's also a writer on the fiction side, I believe. He's also a paranormal investigator, and the thing that I think most people are most excited for me to ask him about was he was part of the Hellier project with the infamous Newkirks earlier this year. It's the one, the only, all the way from Colorado, Mr. Karl Pfeiffer.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's a genuine pleasure, Karl. Now, I do have to say, Karl and I were both lamenting before we started recording this. We've both got dodgy throats. So if you hear either of us clearing our throat a lot, or it sounds like we're slurping, we're not having a breakdown or anything. We're actually trying to keep our throats going. Isn't that right?
Yeah, a bit of a bout with I assume, laryngitis last week for me, and then a weekend of shouting over people at Michigan Paracon up in the Upper Peninsula for 3 days and it's a smoky casino no less, so breathing that in all weekend too. And then some low sleep on top, and it's kind of a perfect formula for a husky voice now.
Yes, but you flew up there, I presume.
Yeah.
So things in the air are playing aircon system and all that
No
wonderful
kidding.
stuff.
Yeah, low sleep and thousands of people and airports and exhaustion. It's a good combo for a week of recovery.
Yes. So have you got much planned this week then, or can you sort of take it easy and
I can take it easy as far as staying at home goes, yeah. We're actually going out in a week to film for 2 or 3 weeks the final bit of Season 2 of Hellier. So this is a lot of me trying to get my notes in order to know exactly what we need to shoot for interviews and stuff, or what we've already shot, and all that. So it's kind of just packing up and getting ready. But on the plus side, nothing too strenuous, so that I can actually kind of get a full night's sleep in and be healthy enough to hit the road all over again.
So were you at the Paracon this weekend as a Hellier sort of representative, or just in general?
I was. It was my first year. It's such a far ways up there, and I've always been such a starving artist that sometimes I have to just kind of sit aside with the FOMO, the fear of missing out, until the right project takes off that can help get me out there. So when Hellier came out this year, it was, lucky enough, it was such a big splash that it was very short order that they called us up and asked us if we wanted to do a Hellier panel. So we went up there and we released a bunch of merchandise that people have been asking us for all summer, and we finally announced that and put that out there for the first time. We'll have a web store for it later. And then we had the panel and debuted the trailer for Season 2. Brilliant. So it's kind of a big Hellier weekend.
Is the trailer on YouTube then for Season 2 yet, or will it be
Not
going
yet.
onto YouTube?
Yes, this week is going to be coming out along with the release date information, and we're behind the scenes on that, about to pull the trigger. So is this going up on Wednesday? Was it?
Yes, Wednesday.
Yeah. If it's not up now, quote unquote, it should be up very, very soon. We're just kind of coordinating the release vehicles for it.
Wow. Well, let's talk Hellier, because that was one of the things people have asked me to talk about. I know we're going to be talking about the Stanley Hotel, which I'm really looking forward to, because I genuinely think The Shining is one of the... And I know the film wasn't actually shot at the Stanley. We'll talk about all that. It's one of the scariest films, I think, psychologically as well. But and especially when you talk about how Stephen King came up with the concept for The Shining and all that, I think it's typical writer really, where you get your inspiration from. But Hellier is something that a lot of people have said, talk to him about Hellier. Did you guys, so yourself and the Newkirks, did you expect it to be the hit it is?
No. I think, all of us definitely wondered about what it could be, or what we hoped it would be. But as far as actually expecting it, we tried to manage our expectations as much as we could. I've been making more and more projects and trying to do cooler work in terms of the documentary space and the video space, but I've been very used to releasing certain promos and projects to a relatively small audience that stay in that relatively small audience. But I also knew that Greg and Dana had spent a lot of time building up an outlet for themselves, whether that's with their website Weekend Weird that gets tons and tons of visitors going through it every month, or whether that's their own fan base that they built from scratch with their traveling museum of the paranormal and the occult. It's all been kind of a great combination of putting together that look of the show from my end with the outlet and resources that they had, and with a story that we knew from all the blogs I wrote about it earlier back in the day, and from my own sort of addiction to it. We knew that seemed pretty much as good to a perfect formula to do something independently and get it to spread as far as it could, and do it all ourselves.
Because what I liked about when I've sort of watched episodes from it is it's not done in a Hollywood way. It's done in, and this is a compliment, it doesn't sound, it's done in a very low key sort of inoffensive, unobtrusive, just stating the facts and stating what's going on, and I like that, because it's sort of, I think stuff like that hits you more, because when you get the sort of Hollywoodized, like dun dun dun, the deep voice behind saying in 2012, you kind of like switch off a bit and like, oh yeah, right, it's a load of hooey, it can't be real. You've got to get the deep voice in it to make it sound dramatic. Yeah. But Hellier doesn't have any of that. And no. And was that how you envisaged when you were planning it?
It really was. I've taken a lot of inspiration from a lot of things in my own life that appeal to me as an individual. And we've seen in the last 15, 20 years a real kind of cookie cutter formula with a lot of the paranormal shows out there. There's not a lot of experimentation or variety. They just kind of they see. I've said this before, but when it comes to TV networks and the Hollywood industry, and something I don't really blame them for because it's business, but their primary goal is to get as many eyeballs as possible on a particular project so that they can sell more ads and commercials and make money, because it's a business. Yeah. So what they do when they see as a successful show comes out is they find that formula and they say that's what people want, so let's change the smallest little piece of it to make it slightly different, and then we'll tap into that same audience too. And I think that typically there's a lot of oversight. They miss a lot of stuff in terms of what it was that was making that first show special and trying to adapt those other things. For example, characters, Yeah. A lot of shows are just like, oh, cool, they do this and then this and then this. We'll do that too with different people. But like Ghost Hunters, for example, they spent like 2 years trying to find their formula. And in that time, you really got to know everyone as characters on the screen each week. And that's what got people tuning back in. They were like, I want to go hang out with my buddies on this show in a sense. Yeah. So that was something that I knew would be important when I made Hellier, for example, was I spent a lot of time at the beginning introducing everyone and spending some time before we went diving right into things. So it was little nuances like that I was paying attention to, but I always wanted to do an artistic, cinematic, cerebral paranormal show, something like the documentaries that I like to watch about other content, but about the paranormal, because it's usually either just running around in the dark ghost hunting, or it's, like an ancient aliens just talking heads talking to you with bad animations for an hour. Yeah. So I wanted to do something kind of artistic that explored some high concept ideas, that did it in a pretty way, that looked like it was a scripted movie when it wasn't, because you can't talk about the stuff that this case seems to be about in 10-second sound bites. The documentary style was really the way to do it, especially to illustrate something in the way that I thought about it, which was kind of wondrously.
Yeah. I think I like the fact it wasn't sort of screamy people running around, or one of the things that I know enough of the sort of the TV ghost hunters, and I know them well enough when I talk to them. I know how those shows are made. I know it looks like they get 45 minutes of amazing activity. I know full well that's 72 hours of filming to get those 45 minutes, and it's something when you get people coming on an event. I call them ghost hunts. When you get them coming on a public ghost hunt, and nothing happens for 3 hours, or the only thing that happens is you hear a slight noise in the background that you can't explain, and they're like, I watch those shows on telly and they've got stuff going off every 2 minutes. Why is it not happening here? And trying to explain to them it's not in real time. It's not like you're watching an episode of 24. They'll have spent 2 or 3 days in that location. Their clothes don't change. That's all part of it. So it creates that illusion that this paranormal stuff. Now, I'm not saying that you can't do 45 minutes in somewhere and everything gets literally thrown at you. We've all had sort of things where you sat somewhere and within 10 minutes of sitting down, things start happening. But then again, you've probably had investigations where you've been somewhere for 6 hours and it's still, if you pardon the pun, dead as a dodo.
Constantly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's everything in between. So it's interesting to watch a show that it's a proper documentary, and it's not trivialising it, it's not glamorising it, it's not making it out to be something it isn't. And I do actually think that's something that the paranormal world is crying out for, because we're so used to, like you say, the shows with the same concept. And they're great shows. I mean, I love the fact, our mutual friend Richard Estep calls them location porn. And it's great for me doing shows like this, because I can watch those and go, God, that's a really good place. Never thought of that one. I'll do a show on that. Great.
Yeah.
But the amount of people who say they've learnt their trade from watching those shows is quite concerning. And so I do think stuff like Hellier I was so pleased to see it come out, and I'm so pleased there's going to be another series. I look forward to watching it.
Thank you. Yeah, there is more coming on the way. The first one really came about from just us going down to film with what we had to try to figure out what was going on, and we weren't even expecting when we went to the town if that was really going to wind up being a piece of what we were shooting. Maybe it was just going to be an hour retrospective of this weird story. So a lot of those little nuances and aspects of the research, those wound up mattering down the road when we found connections or the drama of just sort of expectations and disappointment, So I think that it was a really elegant case to show those aspects of research and investigation that the other shows kind of might feel are a little boring as compared to running around in the dark getting scared. But I think that when you start to find those connections and you start to discover things from that research, then that becomes exciting too in its own kind of way. And that was one of the aspects and the ways that it naturally kind of bubbled up while shooting season 1.
You're talking to a historian who gets excited when she finds links between things. So it's the amount of times that synchronicity, and I know that's a word you mentioned. I think it was the first episode the word synchronicity was mentioned quite a lot, wasn't it? It's something that I did watch it. It's
you
something,
do know it.
I did. It's something that I find happens all the time. I'll have done a show, and 3 months later I'll do a show on something else that doesn't look like there could be any connection. And I'll be like, crumbs, I actually remember reading up on this 3 months ago, and I go back and check my notes, and there's a link that it could be something from Australia to something in Germany or whatever. It's not an obvious link. And It's a very, but yeah, so I get excited about that when the pieces start being put together in the research and you start to see the picture evolving from the research and everything. It is exciting, and I think more people enjoy it than TV companies realise. But I think those people have to step up and say, we want to watch stuff like this. This is what we want to see. Mm-hmm.
It goes back to that mass appeal, I think, and the network's trying to please as many people as are possible. And I know that there's a bunch of people that don't want to see that stuff, even if there is a weird connection. They just want you to tell it beat by beat and get to the scary stuff. So we basically just kind of targeted the people that were like us, who wanted to see what we wanted to see, and that's not going to appeal to everyone. But there is a big chunk that really do want that, and if we can make friends with that chunk, then great, that's because that's our people, because at the end of the day, just like any creative pursuit, they say, write or shoot or create the thing that you want to consume, and there's definitely going to be other people that want to consume that too, and it'll reach them.
I mean, I was like that when I wrote my first book. I wrote it for me. I didn't necessarily write it that it would be a bestseller, because and the fact that people have bought it and still buy it, it kind of, it makes me go, oh, wow, maybe people do like what I've got to say. But I didn't write it for anyone else apart from me. And I think that shows when you do a project that you've got that passion in. You're not doing it to do for somebody else, you're doing it for you. And you kind of hope that other people will like it as well.
Of course,
but it shows. It really, really shows. So, if you could do a documentary on anything, what would you love to do a documentary on?
I mean, really, it was kind of Hellier. At the end of the day, what I would want to do, the paranormal is my passion, and making these videos, these documentary-style, cinematic-type videos, is my passion. So, being able to combine those two is what it's all about for me. And working with my friends that I get along with who have a weird story that they're directly engaging with. That's the dream. If I could do that full time and continue to create that and pay my bills, then that's what I would want to do. There's different topics, in and out throughout history that would be really exciting to make docs on of various different lengths. Series are kind of fun because I've gotten very into TV shows over movies in the last few years. I like ongoing narratives that kind of weave in and out.
Yeah.
I think, if there was anything I could shoot a doc on, time not being important, it would almost certainly be that Mothman prophecy story that came up in Hellier conveniently and oddly enough, because that wasn't something we were forcing into the story, but is kind of that story that you're like, man, like you just hear about this wide, I like stuff to get as weird as possible, and I like them to be mysterious and creepy and far-reaching and ongoing. I love that kind of like boots on the ground, two people trying to figure it out. And I think Mothman is one of the best kind of stories of that when it comes to the paranormal. That is both compelling information, would be super fun to film and try to get something maybe on video that's strange, but also to follow like a story of two people's quest for high strangeness. So that one is kind of where my brain goes back to as far as like the perfect storm of all the elements of a great documentary series.
It would. So the next one's called Mothman, is it?
I wish. No, part of the
Greg,
Mothman story.
Dana, you've got another project.
Yeah, keep working on that time machine, you guys, because the second one needs to be happening in 66 and 67. That's why it's so strange that ours kind of fit into that whole thing, though, because for not being able to have a time machine, we certainly have tapped into one that directly links into that original case in such a strange way. It's kind of like a sequel to it now.
Well, there you go. It's meant to be.
Yeah.
It's meant to be. Well, one of the other things that that Karl is, you may not know, Karl is well known for, and he was kind enough to answer some questions I had on this for my book that I'm writing at the moment. And I know I'm going to get hounded in the chat room. Sure, you've written a book, Penny. You're writing another book. We didn't know. Well, I've got to get it out there, because if I don't talk about it, who else will? He was kind enough to write, because one of the chapters I'm writing on in my new book is about something called the Estes Method. And Karl and his, I suppose, call him your paranormal partner? Would that be? Yeah. Connor Randall. My mind just went blank then. I was thinking, what was his surname? I just completely forgot it for a split second then. But him and Connor came up with the Estes Method. Now, we're not going to talk about it too much, because I want to get on to talking about the Stanley, because we've got loads of stuff to talk about with the Stanley. But for those of you who don't know, the Estes is basically using a spirit box. I think you guys, which one do you prefer?
It kind of started, and we've kind of stayed with the SB7.
The 7,
spirit box.
Yeah, I prefer the 7. And having it so that, well, Karl, you tell us. Give us a brief outline of what the Estes was all about.
It started at the Stanley Hotel, right? Because Connor and I, and by the end it was Connor, myself, and Michelle Tate from Ghost Hunters, running the weekend paranormal investigations for the public. And I've been doing that by the end of it for like 5.5 years. We'd done 250 investigations of the property at that point. And years before, probably during the time when I was working with an investigator named Callie, after the investigations, we used to have like a bunch of late night talks and stuff like that. If friends came around, we'd chat with them. And I know that in one of those conversations, the idea came up with putting on a set of headphones into the spirit box, which scans through radio stations at high rates of speed. And of course you get little clips of DJ voices and songs and commercials that come out, and sometimes it sounds like those little bits and pieces of words and sentences answer your questions very specifically. But it's easy to kind of hear what you want to hear with it. And so we always thought it was kind of an interesting idea to maybe plug in headphones into that and see if you still hear them clearer, or if you don't hear them anymore, or if you can't hear the questions is the key to that. Will you still be able to hear those types of responses coming through? So for whatever reason, it took like 3-4 years later, whenever this idea, which I don't even remember how or when it came up, years later, it always kind of bounced around in my head. And so in 2016, there was one night we were doing an investigation by ourselves, and we just decided, let's pull out a set of headphones and try that for once. So we pulled out some pretty bad headphones. They weren't great, and we didn't have a blindfold or anything to really cut us off, but we kind of covered our ears as best we could and turned up the volume. And the others started asking questions. And of that first time, we all tried it, but Connor seemed like he got the best responses, and there were a few that seemed like they were direct responses that we thought seemed to be very interesting. So we tried it again the next night, and Connor is a member of a band. He's a drummer. So he's got these big old hefty drummer headphones that cut out 20 decibels of sound or whatever, and without being noise canceling though. And we put those on and then decided it because we were filming at the time as well, and we figured it's one thing to close your eyes, it's another thing to completely cover them so that you can't see any even telltale clues about what we're talking about or doing. So we introduced headphones to it, and we've gotten consistently, time and time again, some of the strangest and perfectly conversational responses coming out of this thing that seems to be more than just the coincidence of a applicable answer once or twice now and again. It seems to be very conversational. So whether or not there's a psychic component of that, whether or not, skeptically speaking, if somehow the body has a super, super sensitive sensibility that we could still pick out the question subliminally in some way and subliminally filter it up to the brain that the person should answer it. I'm not sure how that works. There's ways that we test around that. But it was compelling enough that we continued to do it, and word spread, and it's been working for other people, and it makes its appearances on the TV shows and whatnot, and it's become quite a phenomenon.
It is. Well, it's one of the experiments I've done in my new book, and I kind of I changed a few bits. I don't know, you guys have probably done this already, but not the initial one that I tried it that I was in a separate room to the person who was asking the questions to see if we got anything, and then we swapped. Also, what was another way? I record not just what's coming out of the spirit box, but me speaking when I speak what I'm hearing as well, to see if that picks up any kind of EVP or something, and I've had a few things come off that. But I love the spirit box. I know it's some people sort of slate it and say it's just a broken radio, but I've had too many weird things happen with it. Coincidence. I know I was in an old fort, and I had the headphones, and I wasn't doing proper Estes, but sort of ish. I couldn't hear the question that I was walking around. It was middle of the day, and the person who was asking the questions was answering, but I was sort of wandering around, eyes open, but I couldn't see them or hear them. And apparently she suddenly, I heard in the thing, "I'm over here," and she walked over to me, tapped me on the shoulder, and she went, "The spirit's there," just as I'd heard it say, "I'm over here." And another one, it said, "Are you American?" I mean, that many silly, "Are you American?" I've recorded it, it's clear as day. And I went, "No, I'm not American." And they were laughing at me, and I was like, "Why are you laughing at me?" And they went, "Those people over there, they're Americans, and you've just yelled out because you've got big headphones on. Are you American?" "No, I'm not American." And she said they were giving me some very strange looks. So, but I didn't know they were American, and it was clear as day. "Are you American?" And they were American tourists. So, and they were the only other people there, apart from us. So it's a very interesting experiment to do, and I think it's psychological. I understand what you mean about if you just hear something, you get almost like audio pareidolia, don't you? Your brain tries to make sense out of chaos, so therefore. But when it's been recorded and then you play it back to other people and ask, "Well, what can you hear?" and they hear exactly the same thing that you did, it's a lot harder to use that.
It's hard as a subjective sort of scenario, because, like, does something sound like this word? You know, it's tricky sometimes depending on if they know if the word or the sentence is there ahead of time. Sometimes it's super clear and it's undeniable. That's why I like sentences a lot more than like single syllable words. For example, one of the spirits up at the Stanley that kind of showed up, he was kind of our big plot line running through our last 2 years up there. His name was Eddie. He kind of just showed up as best we know and decided he was a spirit up there now, and he was one of our more active ones towards the end. He was around when we introduced the spirit box experiment, and we would get his name coming through all the time. Ed, really? Eddie, Ed. But now we still get it, even for the last 3 years being not at the Stanley anymore. When we plug in, it seems like almost every time Connor is on, he hears the word Ed, and we all kind of roll our eyes. We're like, oh, we're hearing it again. We're trying not to make this about Eddie and the Stanley, but here he is. But it does kind of feel like, we certainly think, in fact, indeed, that he is still with us, but also we've been critical because we're skeptical of everything we do. We try to take that scientific mindset without being scientists, certainly, but that mindset of being critical about our results and trying to make them better.
Things.
Yeah, exactly. And we're very aware of the fact that, like, Ed is, a suffix of a word, of a lot of words, like it's ED comes with a lot of different words out there. So we're aware of the fact that if we're scanning through these radio stations, things sound like Ed pretty easily when it's just that one syllable, it can come through pretty easy. So that's something that we try to stay aware of. But at the same time, when something kind of happens clearly and with variety, you do start to wonder if that's more objective.
Yeah.
But it's why I like sentences, because if he says, hey, it's Eddie, I'm here, that's a little bit harder to argue with than just like Ed, just kind of clipping through for a second.
Well, that's why I got excited when I had I'm over here and then are you American? I mean, the amount of sweeps that would have gone through for those sort of phrases to come out. It's very hard to sort of say it was just the radio because I can't remember what sweep rate I had it on, but it wasn't slow. So I know what you mean. If it's just a one-word answer, it could be anything. But when it's got more than one syllable to it, makes it a lot more interesting.
Yeah, that's why I like the conversational stuff back and forth as well. Anything, because the basic idea, right? Is what are the chances that a word or a short phrase is going to apply to what you're talking about? It's very hard to kind of like put that in a box because there's so many, I think between like 1 and 300,000 words in the English language, and how many of those are going to apply to a certain conversational point or any question that you ask is something that's very hard to quantify. And so, but if you can continue to have a conversation where you get specific answers that might even just be one word amongst hundreds of thousands that apply to what you're talking about, and that's ongoing, eventually you have to recognize that those odds are pretty close to impossible at that point.
Yeah. As
opposed to, it's the other side too, though, is it's why we try to ask a lot of control questions to validate that a spirit is there. We try to ask specifics. We try to give it one word to say that would have impossible odds to come out at that moment. And there is some struggle there, it seems like, from the spirit. Whether or not that's that they can't get that good, whether they don't like being put on the spot, or whether or not that's validation that it is just maybe a random coincidence, because one word is easier than a sentence that could apply to a lot of stuff. In that way, we do struggle with getting specific answers. That always makes me wonder, but it's interesting to kind of approach from that almost semi-scientific mindset of trying to figure out, like, statistically speaking, like, how often should this work, whether it's a ghost or whether it's not, like, what are we doing here, and could it just be coincidence? Because I'm curious about that. Like anything, I kind of go back and forth on stuff being like, is this legit or not, especially the more people that start to do it and get good results.
Well, I do find it saying to me, are you American, when I couldn't hear them and I hadn't heard them. American tourists literally 10 feet away from me.
Validation after the fact is always nice,
and I didn't know
when there's
that.
something only, you couldn't have known.
Exactly. It was only when I took my headphones off because my friends were laughing, and I said to them, what did I do? And they went, you yelled out, are you American? No, I'm not. And they were American tourists, and I think I had my back to them as well. I didn't even know they were there. So that kind of thing is a lot. I suppose there is a possibility. It was statistically possible, but
right, you start to chew on that, and you're just kind of like, I don't think so. Could it? But no. And, if it was a pundit, like, Americans are in the news for sure, but like, I am not. I'm like, that's a weird thing to say. It just starts spinning around in circles.
It does, and the fact it was different. It was a woman who'd said, I'm over here. And the person I had with me, who was a medium, she wasn't hearing what I was hearing. All she heard was what I would say, and I hadn't heard it say, I'm over here. And when I asked her afterwards, and I hadn't told her this, I said, this spirit you moved me towards, was it male or female? And she went, it was a female. But then it was an American voice that asked, a male voice that asked if I was American. So
Right.
it was different voices as well, which I know it's possible on a radio to have different voices, but there was other sort of correlations that made it quite interesting. But it is a fascinating experiment. It's one that I'd recommend people to have a go at, because it's got some amazing results.
Yeah, it's turned some skeptics, and like everything, I'm always curious to hear opinions about it. So I always try to encourage everyone to give it a shot anyways and have some fun with it. Especially the ones that kind of critique the fundamentals of it, like, oh, your headphones, you have a beard, so it's not a perfect seal, so, you're probably hearing stuff. And I'm just like...
I haven't got a beard.
Fine. Yeah, exactly. Well, the article that mentioned that, I thought it was very funny, because it's kind of like, well, you forget that everyone has hair at first, so I think the beard is sort of missing your own point, but,
oh, dear.
It's fun. It's nice for people to kind of put on the same gear that we have and try it out and, try to hear answer, like try to fake it even. I'm curious to see how successful that might be, but, it's, at the end of the day, I'm like, we're not trying to pull a fast one on people. We're not on TV trying to get renewed for a second season. It's just like well,
you're not flogging the copyright for the Estes Method, are you?
Yeah, exactly. We're not even selling anything with it. So we're as curious as the next guy about, how it works and how we can make it better. And I love doing variations on it, splitting people up like you did too, to try to test, like, how close to this does the spirit have to be to the questions to, like, provide answers, It's fun to test.
You have to wait and read the book, and you'll find out what my answer was.
Yes, I'm curious. Ours, we've only tried it once ourselves, but it was a bit of a wash. It was hard to tell.
Okay, well, I'll tell you off air what happened, but yeah. So, I have to ask, before we go on to Stanley, are you sitting at the same desk that you filmed Helia sitting at?
Yes, it's moved, but it is the same desk.
Wow. Okay, I'm picturing it now. Okay, yes. So, the Stanley Hotel. Now, most people, I would have thought, have heard of The Shining by Stephen King. And that is probably, I would say, what the Stanley is most famous for, in that the actual film wasn't filmed at the Stanley, was it?
No.
But the series that they made, the Stephen King series, was, if I'm right. Am I right?
Yep.
Yep. But Stephen King, it was staying at the Stanley that gave him the inspiration for The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's pretty cool. And the reason he got the inspiration, from what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that the Stanley at that point in time used to shut down after the summer. It would be shut for the whole winter. And Stephen King and his wife were there when there was literally just, pardon the pun, skeleton staff.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly he had a nightmare where wasn't it something to do with his 3-year-old son?
It was. Yeah, he'd come up there towards the end of the season. He was one of the only people there, kind of like The Shining. He was working on a story about a family living in isolation. But apparently his first idea was like a theme park, and it wasn't quite working right. Mm-hmm. So he was chewing on that when they were up at the hotel, and he'd wandered around for a little bit earlier, but he woke up from that nightmare that one of the old fire hoses in the hallways had come off the wall and was chasing his young son like a snake. Mm-hmm. And it scared him awake. And the story goes that he went over to the window and lit himself up a cigarette and thought about it. And before the cigarette was done, apparently he'd composed in his mind the whole story of what happened.
Right.
He went home and wrote it.
And I still think it's possibly one of the scariest ones that he wrote.
I think it's one of his best.
I agree. I think that, Christine and Carrie are my favourites.
Old school, nice.
Oh yeah, the old ones. Yeah, definitely the old ones. I like those ones because they ask a lot of questions in your mind. I like those kind of horror things, not the in your face stuff.
I'm a huge fan of Stephen King, and those are good. He wrote a lot of heavy implication books. Make you question.
Talking about horror books, though, have you read much James Herbert, the English writer?
Yeah. Herbert. Was that the author of Doom? Dune?
Rats and the Fog and all those ones.
Oh, yeah. I actually, back in middle school, I think I read The Fog.
Right.
Yeah.
He did some towards the end of his career before he passed away that I think were actually more, wow, that could be going on behind someone's curtains. That could be going on behind closed doors, kind of horror books. But, yeah, I like early Stephen King, things like Carrie. I remember reading Christine when I was 16, 17, and being scared to get in a car for about a month as a result. And Carrie is just, wow. Even the film, I think, with Sissy Spacek in is it still makes me jump at the end. But and I've seen it a lot. But yeah, The Shining. The Shining's such a good book. Such a good book. So it's not really surprising he got the inspiration when you look at the layout, you look at how sort of there's not a lot there, is there, really, around it? It's quite open.
Yeah.
But what I found fascinating was where the hotel came from in the first place, and the fact that it was built by an industrialist, Freeland Stanley, who suffered from TB. And he'd had a recurrence of TB, I think, in about the very, very early 1900s, 1903, according to the logs I was reading. And that part of Colorado apparently was seen to be similar to where the European lungers, as they were known, went in Switzerland. And he was sent to Colorado to sort of take on the fresh air, the diet, healthy exercise and all that kind of thing. And he was so enamoured with the place, he decided to build the hotel.
Yes, exactly. He had a miracle sort of recovery that just doesn't really ever happen with tuberculosis. So we're not sure even today if it was a misdiagnosis or just kind of the miracle cure. But due to that, fell in love with the area, and they wound up moving out. And then they needed to build a guest house, as he said, so his wife Flora could entertain all of her friends. So the Stanley was their guest house.
Yeah,
and just majestic, kind of a perfect spot overlooking the whole valley there.
It's beautiful. It is a beautiful, beautiful place. I was looking at photos. I've never been there, sadly, but looking at the photos of it. But yeah, so it's saying he survived. He lived until he was 91.
Yeah,
which for someone who'd had recurrent TB, there must be something magical about Colorado, the way it fixed him, or it might have been a misdiagnosis.
It'll either fix your tuberculosis or you'll have altitude sickness for a weekend or something. It's one or the other. You're going to enjoy it or you won't.
But so, as someone who's investigated there a lot, I mean, you don't investigate there anymore because the hotel kind of has changed its policy, shall we say, on investigations. They kind of, like, we've had places in the UK do that. They suddenly decide that, no, we're not going to be associated with that. It's bad for business. We're going to do our own thing. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. But we won't talk about that one. But
can of worms.
Do you think the Stanley has got its reputation as being a spooky place because of Stephen King, or is it because it has got resident spirits there?
It's an interesting question. I feel like it's yes, no, both, necessarily both. There's a lot of perspectives on it, and something that I've thought about a lot. I think the Stanley has The Shining as a part of its history that I can't separate. Like it was a seasonal hotel, right? Up through the 70s when Stephen King stayed there. The Shining gave it an added reputation. Mm-hmm. By the 80s and 90s, it was a pretty decrepit hotel. Like, all the buildings on the property except for the main building were closed down and kind of condemned. So the present day kind of sprawling campus of these really pretty buildings and these new buildings surrounding it and the manicured fields, that was not really a thing through the 80s and the 90s. It had fallen into pretty bad disrepair, and it was I think in a lot of ways it was bringing The Shining back home to it. It was the late 90s that the Stephen King miniseries was filmed there. That gave, I think, it that second boost of attention, that was actually an aspect. I think that they probably didn't mind the filming confusion for a little while after that if it was a draw. It appeared on Ghost Hunters in 2004, 2005, somewhere in there. And I think that helped that ghost hype because it did seem to have spirits. But when I left the hotel in 2016, my current kind of operating theory that was tickling the back of my mind a lot was the question of how much of a role we ourselves have in hauntings. How much is our beliefs and our expectations informing the activity that actually happens? I would always there's a room in the basement of the concert hall at the Stanley, which was where we did most of our investigating. That room was known as Lucy's room, and it had a pretty notorious door that seemed to close on its own. And you get so many people, in a room in the middle of the night looking at that door saying, like, Lucy, if you're here, can you close that door? Can you close it for us? And you've got like 20 people or 15 people or however many focused on that door willing it to close, and then it closes. Like, is that a ghost or is that us?
A form of telekinesis almost.
Exactly. And does the brain need to does the conscious brain need a little bit of justification or excuse or possibility to overrule any sort of like belief? Like, does doubting your telekinesis kill your telekinesis, right? But if you can blame it on a spirit, does that give your abilities or your subconscious mind enough of an excuse to like make it happen? Right? So that whole kind of idea from the small scale like that to the large scale of like how many people thinking of something or believing in something does it take for that something to start to manifest and become real? And when you have a tale like The Shining with millions of readers around the world projecting that onto a mountain hotel in Colorado, how much of that starts to become true? Was the hotel particularly haunted before 1976 when Stephen King was there? Those are kind of curious questions that I think that sort of group projection might have an effect on. You get people going through on tours, hearing this story. This person was real. This person existed. This person haunted this place. Lucy, the spirit of a young lady who was homeless, who ran away from home. She stayed at the hotel for a little while, and when she was kicked out, when they found her living in the condemned concert hall basement, she froze to death in the town of Estes Park later that winter. That was the story we used to tell about Lucy up at the Stanley. A sweet spirit, a lovely spirit. She'd come out, and she'd be kind of quiet and sweet and play with people's hair and stuff. There's zero documentation that anyone died from exposure in all of Larimer County in the 70s and the 80s in Estes Park. So where did that story come from? Where did that root come from when, for everything I knew for 5 years, we were engaging with a spirit that seemed to fit that story and was happy to fit that story for us? Is that from us? Is that from our belief? Is that a spirit who's happy to play that role? So that idea of belief in story starts to make me very curious what its role is in a haunting.
Do we know when the Lucy story started?
As best I can pin down, it started between 2004 or 5 when Ghost Hunters came up first, and there was the story that the guy told of an old homeless lady that was living in the concert hall, and that became a young homeless woman named Lucy who died from exposure when she was kicked out in 1977, when I started in 2010. So there's kind of a 5-year window.
It's interesting, though, when
there.
you think of the film The Shining, doesn't he go out into the snow and freeze?
Right? There's kind of a structural similarity there.
Yeah.
Whether that's an echo or whether that was intended by somebody who took it upon themselves to beef up that story when they got to the hotel, perhaps, or if they were starting up ghost hunts or tours or something, perhaps a little embellishment happened. But some of those structures are interesting. I always find that curious in a subconscious kind of perspective.
Yeah. I mean, as a historian and a researcher, it's sort of thing that if I was over in your neck of the woods, I'd be going into the records offices, I'd be looking for death records, I'd be looking for... Because, excuse me, if she had a post-mortem done on her, for example, that would have been logged, especially if we're talking 1950 onwards. I mean, one of the benefits of when I'm looking into American history is because your history is modern compared to ours. A lot more things are documented. You know, so in the UK we don't tend to start having, I mean, our census records, I think they go back to about 18 something or other. So, but if I'm looking for confirmation of birth and death, I have to start looking at parish records. That's if they still exist. They only go back to, if I'm lucky, late 1500s for some parishes. So it's very hard to go back and trace stories like witchcraft stories and all of those kind of things that predate, well, pretty much the 1700s. Anything predating that, you're struggling a bit. So if you've got a story that's meant to have been any time from 1909 onwards, it will be something will be documented somewhere. And it's just finding it, because, you know, there was recording of things and all of that sort. So the story I read about, there was a head housekeeper who died from injuries, Elizabeth Wilson.
Yeah, she didn't actually die from those. She survived those. But yeah, that's a well-documented one.
So that is true. That's a true story. Okay, because she's meant to be, I think, isn't it in room 217? She's not meant to like people who, shall we say, shack up in there, who are married.
The old legend about her, she was a housekeeper of the hotel. Gosh, I haven't talked about this one in so long. I can't quite recall the year. I think it was very recent.
I've seen different. I heard it was during one of the things I heard. It was during 1911, during a storm. She was sorting out the gas lights or something in that room. But that room,
I think it was recently after the opening of the hotel.
Yeah, but that didn't make sense to me because it had electricity. Because didn't Stanley build the Fall River hydro plant to supply electricity to the hotel? So she wouldn't have been messing with gas lights. So I kind of raised a question when I read the account about her. But
yeah, whether or not he made that plan, if it took him a couple of years to make that, like if he to supply the hotel, or if it was different. But yeah, no, I think, I can't remember if there was a power outage and so they went back to the gas lamps that night or something like that. I can't remember. Right. But that she went up to that room while everyone was kind of elsewhere in the building, and she went to light the gas lamp in that room, but it had been leaking, and so the whole room exploded out. Pieces were found like a mile away, as I understand. And so she fell through down to the room underneath, but survived it actually, and they kind of took her down to the hospital down in Longmont, and allegedly, as the story goes, it was Mr. Stanley who came down and was by her bedside and paid for her visits and made sure she was okay and gave her a job for as long as she ever wanted it at the hotel, if she ever wanted to come back. Wow. And it said that she worked there for a long time after that, I think up to the 40s. But there's newspaper accounts and documentations of that explosion. The face of the hotel is actually slightly different from the mirroring side. After the explosion, you can see in photos it wasn't built back the same way.
So have you ever come across Mrs. Wilson?
I haven't. The 217 is like the most famous room. That's the suite. Stephen King stayed in there, and so it's famously haunted by Mrs. Wilson too. So I think for the way we investigated at the hotel typically was we had the concert hall all to ourselves, and we would try to get an additional room or space in the main building that we could kind of swap back and forth with. And 217 is the one that was kind of always booked out for a year in advance. So we weren't in it as often as I might have liked. But the weird thing about the rooms are they all kind of almost seem to rotate for different people. There's 5 probably like most famous haunted rooms at the hotel. And it seemed like of all of us who would routinely investigate the place, we each had a different favorite room because we'd had some sort of weird story in it. And somebody else would be like, yeah, that room, nothing really ever happened though. But this room... So for me, that's 217. I didn't ever really have anything happen in there. The couple times I've been in, half a dozen or so. But other rooms have been like more compelling for me personally. It's kind of weird the way that sort of like sparks or ignites for different people individually on different nights.
So what was your favourite part of the hotel to investigate?
Yeah, my favorite part of the hotel, right, was the concert hall, just because that was like our 80-90% of the time place that we could be in, that we could trust the activity because it was just us, and we kind of made friends with the spirits there. So it was kind of special in a friendship kind of a way. Outside of that building was probably 401, Lord Dunraven's room. I had a kind of a strange night in there at one point a couple of years back. And then 1402 in the manor house, that was the second building between the concert hall and the main building. One of my weirdest experiences happened in there, and that room will always kind of be forever associated with in my brain. 1302 over there.
What was the weird experience?
All right, it's a good story. It kind of ties in over to your neck of the woods overseas at the end of it. But I always love telling this one because it's a little bit non-traditional. I was up there a couple of months into my time at the hotel. It was a couple days before New Year's, as I recall, and it was just myself and Connor and the original investigator at the hotel up there, whose name was Callie. And this was my first. I wasn't officially working up there yet. That came a couple weeks later, so we were just kind of up there for fun. And this was my first chance to investigate one of the haunted rooms. So 1302 was open that night. We found so it had been a quiet night in the concert hall, so we moved over to 1302 and checked it out. And it was about an hour in at that point. It was probably 2 a.m., 1 a.m., something like that. And I always joke it's my favorite story to tell as a ghost hunter, but one of my least respectable moments of a ghost hunter, my least professional moments, because I was starting to doze off in the bed in that room.
Okay.
I was like,
seriously, we've all done it. Don't worry.
Exactly. It's the only really one that has tainted my record, but as I'm kind of dozing off in the bed there on the quiet night, it's this kind of dream takes over, like out of nowhere, real quick, the way that the mind wanders. And it's like I'm standing at a peephole or something in a door, looking out, and what I see is this face looking back at me. And it's a man's face, almost like it was crossed with a pig's face, like half and half. No hair or anything, just wispy little hairs, almost goblin ears kind of sticking out. And instead of eyes, there's only these two eye sockets. Now, what's typically kind of a pretty scary-looking figure that would be didn't faze me. I was just kind of looking at it like, okay, And then as soon as I kind of snapped into it, I was like, wait, that's a little weird. That just brought me out of it. So I was probably only dozing for like 10, 20 seconds at most. It was not like I'd fallen deeply asleep. And so I kind of grunted about it, and Callie and Connor were kind of like, what, did something happen? And I said, well, I don't know. I described it, and they said, Carl, you're freaking us out. And I was like, well, I don't feel like it's evil or anything or necessarily like here with us, but I just saw this thing. And Callie pointed out, she said, no, Carl, you're freaking us out because that's not the first time I've heard that thing described before. And I said, well, tell me more. And she says, well, the resident psychic at the hotel, Madame Vera, she's got kind of a shop down in the basement of the hotel where she does readings all day and stuff if people like them. She allegedly described that exact same thing in that exact same room about a year beforehand. And I said, well, okay, now you're starting to freak me out a little bit. And apparently she described this thing as an elemental spirit, right? Older than the hotel itself.
Yeah.
That I just kind of tapped into for whatever reason in that area. So I thought that was interesting. Well, a couple weeks later, I was writing an article for a magazine about Lep Castle over in Ireland, which is notorious for its elemental spirit that's haunting it.
Very notorious for its elemental in the tower, isn't it?
Exactly,
the Bloody Tower, I think it's called.
Yeah. The Bloody Chapel, I think, yeah.
That's it, yeah.
From the old fanboy in me from back in the day, it was like my favorite Ghost Hunters episode. I'd love to check it out and all that. Well, I was reading the old records, the old diary that the original, or that the owner's wife, who first experienced the activity in that property in the 1800s, she would write a diary about the experiences she was having with this elemental spirit, and she described it as half man, half animal, with eyes so dark that they looked like or were eye sockets. And I thought, that's so weird, because there's that validation there that I didn't know or didn't remember going into this one random experience. and it all starts to line up with it being referred to as an elemental, with the elemental of Lep Castle having the same physical description with the eye sockets. All of that just for a random thought, dream-like moment that popped into my head. I thought was very strange and added more of that validation element that I really like in a good paranormal story, that kind of makes it a little richer and deeper there.
Definitely. Wow. Okay. Well, I was going to say I wouldn't mind going to room 428 where people have said they've seen the friendly cowboy sitting on the end of the bed, but yours is a much better story.
Right? I mean, I wish more, or I'd be curious if more people had experienced that, and perhaps had seen that sort of thing before too. But yeah, all the times I told it, I've never really heard of anyone else seeing that there, other than the old story from Vera and mine. But weird little dream thing. I'm not a psychic person. I don't have any sensitive moments, but that was definitely something coming right through. So that's my weird one.
That is a very strange one, especially like you say, the fact that the resident psychic had a similar experience, or same experience, and you didn't know anything about it. I'm sure there's other people who've had it, but just don't realise what they've experienced.
Yeah,
because they haven't got
it really
to talk to.
Yeah, it developed into kind of an unanswered question, because that was at the very beginning of my time at the hotel, and and 5 years later, when it all went away, we never really ran into a whole lot of like elemental type presence like that around the grounds. We never really heard a whole lot of story directly tying any sort of nature spirits or anything in particular to the land, other than it being like a native kind of sacred site. So that really early on raised a lot of questions about the more inhuman side of the spiritual activity up there at the hotel, without really giving too much later. So if there is an aspect of the spirit activity up there on an inhuman scale, I think it's very reserved, and it's very stays to the back a lot more. But still weird that it would even pop out that much on my early time there. I don't know why.
No. Well, my last question about Stanley, because we've been chatting for an hour, believe it or not.
Wow.
I know. The scene of a horror film, is it a scary place, though?
Not at all. It's a beautiful place. Like whether or not we're still kind of annoyed with how things kind of like went with the recognition of the spirits there at the hotel, and the recognition of that side of things. Every time I go up, if I've got a gig up there, or if I'm just passing through, it's got this incredible kind of presence and peaceful feeling between the view, the character of the building itself. It's got kind of an addictive, friendly personality that gets in your blood, that everyone that visits just wants to go back and sit on that porch or cozy up in front of one of their fireplaces in the lobby. It's a really magical kind of place, and whether or not that is a draw for the spirits as well, or whether or not that sort of like adds to the energy of the spirits coming through, whatever it is, like it's a really kind of peaceful, cozy, and magical kind of place.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't surprise me that a hotel would be haunted, because of all the different people that would have come through it. People would have died there. People die in hotels. It's a known fact. There may not be, Lucy may not have been one of them. That may have been a story that someone's come up with, but I think it's very, very plausible for a hotel to have energies lingering around it, just because of the kind of place it is. But it definitely is an intriguing place, and I know other people I've spoken to who've been there, like you say, they want to go back again. It's kind of a magnet. It's like one of those pieces, once it's got you, it doesn't let go. But it's been interesting to hear your story, and the story about the elemental, because that always makes things a bit different. So wow, thank you ever so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So Hellier 2, when can we expect it?
Hellier 2, it's going to come out, if the word isn't out already online. It will be coming out on Amazon Prime exclusively on Black Friday this year, November 29th. And then 2 weeks later, on Friday the 13th in December, it will be widely available for free on YouTube and on our website for download, so that everyone else who hasn't had the chance to see it on Prime can get their hands on it if they'd like to see it.
Awesome. And the merchandise, is that going to be available worldwide or just in America?
That's a good question. It's something we're working through right now. If we can figure out a good process on that, at least for certain areas or sections. I know that worldwide shipping is always kind of expensive, but if we can get a handle on it, I'd love to be able to do that, because I know, like you were talking about, that there's a lot of folks over there on your neck of the woods that are quite into it. And if we can do it, I would love to do it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Karl.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate it, especially on 9 hours sleep in 72 hours or whatever it was you said you
At least
had.
I got it fixed up last night, so I'm good to go now and happy to do it.
Well, I say thank you so much for your time. I could talk to you for hours, if I'm completely honest, because you're absolutely fascinating. But
thank you. Yeah.
It was wow. Yeah, I've got some things I'm going to tell you off air as well from some of the stuff you were saying. So that's been Karl Pfeiffer. Hasn't he been wonderful? So giving with his information. Really appreciate that. Now, make sure if you haven't checked out the first series of Hellier, go and check it out, and we'll let you know on Parasearch when the second series does land, although Karl has given you the dates. Don't forget his friends, the Newkirks, are going to be at Sage Paracon in November, and I'm sure you can go and talk to them about Hellier as well. They won't mind. Well, next week I'm going to have hopefully some other American guests, and we're going to be talking about Vale Mansion with the guys from Apex. So that should be a bit of a laugh, considering we all end up just laughing about things whenever I seem to talk to them. But tomorrow night you've got the PSH radio show, and I believe our Sam Mason is going to be interviewed herself by Kerry. She's getting the tables turned on a gamekeeper turned poacher and all that kind of thing. But on that note, until next week, take care of yourselves. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.